Greetings. Welcome to Windham World Affairs Council meeting. My name is Ishaq Shaul or Isaac Shaul. I am the chairman of Windham World Affairs Council, and we have here the president of Marlborough College, who will be presenting the program tonight, and the speaker. I just want to let you know that we are a non-profit organization. We do a lot of work to bring speakers from around the country to share their views and thoughts honestly to our community. And of course, tonight we are honored that Marlborough College and their program is coordinating with us, cooperating, and we share their experience with you. In this regard, we could use help, volunteers, those of you who have extra time and would like to share your time and spare some of your time for us to keep the organization going. It is 55 years old organization, Windham World Affairs. I have been a chairman for about 5 years, and we could use many help. So this is there. So let me start tonight in partnership with our dear neighbors at Marlborough College. We began a new series, lectures and talk called Engaging the World. This series is based on the Marlborough College seminar courses designed by Marlborough College President, Dr. Kevin Quigley. For seminar presentation, Dr. Quigley has invited leaders, experts to present to his student various strategies that individuals, organizations, public and private as well as government can use to engage in the world in response to a particular issues or to promote a perfect interest and specific interest. This is one of the objectives of Windham World Affairs Council, and we are happy to have this. In an extraordinary, generous initiative, the Marlborough College has offered to coordinate with Windham World Affairs Council and give us the opportunity to also hear from these same expert speakers in a series of 5 Wednesday evening talks to our community. Tonight is the first of those talks. With this brief introduction, permit me to welcome Dr. Kevin Quigley to introduce our speaker and discuss further about his program and seminar. Dr. Quigley.
Thank you. Isaac, thank you very much. I wanted to begin by thanking you all for coming, and thank you, Scott, for providing such a warm, hospitable space. I think it's really ideal for this kind of conversation. And I wanted to begin just by saying a few more words about this series and give you some sense of how it works in the life of the college. And this is really designed to bring the world to Marlborough and try and bring Marlborough to the world by having our students have a chance for close interaction with some of the leading thought leaders and practitioners in various fields related to what's broadly considered international affairs or foreign policy, but who work on issues that aren't often in the spotlight, aren't covered broadly by mass media, but make really invaluable contributions, but most importantly, They're people who are thoughtful, open, caring, decent human beings who want the opportunity to engage with our students and our community. So for example, Michael had an opportunity to sit in on one of Seth Harder's classes earlier today, as well as he sat in a class that Amr Latif co-teaches with Meg Mott. Many of you will remember Amr was here. I guess that program had been described as the Three Wise Men, but we now, yes, it's the Three Wise Guys, more aptly named the Three Wise Guys. So there's a nice segue between that conversation among those wise guys and some of the remarks that Michael is going to offer. Michael also attended town meeting today and just has been a wonderful presence on campus today, and I wanted to thank Michael for that. There's a bio that you've seen of Michael. He has a broad and deep experience in higher education and in philanthropy. Tonight, he's going to talk about some of the work that the Luce Foundation, and for those who don't know, that foundation is really the legacy of Henry Luce and Claire Booth Luce that created an endowment that they use in a variety of fields. Higher ed is one, religion is another. Higher ed with a particular focus on STEM for women, science, technology, engineering, and math. Really one of the more remarkable private foundations in the country. And he's going to talk about some of that grant making as a case study to talk about the role of religion in international affairs. But he's not going to speak for very long. How's this for a setup? Michael is not going to speak for very long, but he's going to quickly get out. Why not? Because he wants to get on to the question and answers and the discussion with you. So that's really why he's here, to engage with you. So Michael, it's a great pleasure to have you here. And again, thank you, Isaac and Rosalind, for joining with us on this.
After your the opposite. Okay, how's that? Good. Great. After the experience of seeing the Three Wise Guys last month, I think that I'm here to be the unwise guy on a winter night. And Kevin knows that already, and that's the reason he urged me to be brief. I think it's a pleasure to be here. I have not been to Brattleboro for a long time, and I've not been on the Marlboro campus ever. But I'm excited about this series that's been planned, and very grateful for a chance to join you. I think that it's one of the things that my work has been a lot involved in recent years is trying to foster collaborations between academic institutions and the world beyond academic institutions, so that the good stuff that's happening in colleges and universities and other kinds of schools around the country doesn't get trapped there. I think that we have a tremendous issue about dialogue in the country and a capacity to engage one another that's underdeveloped. And so I'm honored to participate in this exciting program at the outset. I thought that I was in the middle of it, and so that you would be sort of seasoned participants. But when Kevin told me about the seminar, it was too good of an opportunity to pass up, even in February in Vermont. I'm a Southern guy. I have a lot of respect for the work that Marlboro is doing. I've watched it for a long time. As Kevin said, I'm very interested in higher education and particularly interested in innovative models. And the capacity of the school to foster this kind of integrative thinking, the sort of work of students as whole persons, the kind of self-designed learning, but also a self-governing institution is rare, as you know, in this country. And so you have a tremendous resource, and I think that they're privileged, too, to collaborate with the World Affairs Council with such a long history and such robust attendance on a school night when it's cold. And so thank you for coming out, and thanks for welcoming me. What I would like to do is really, I'm holding my watch, I'm holding this microphone, I'm holding all kinds of stuff. We'll go in my pocket. Great. What I'd like to do is really to talk for about 20 minutes or 25 minutes and to set up to explore a question with you. And then if you wish to make comments, it doesn't need to be questions, or if you want to take the conversation in a different way that's related to your interests or to my work, I'm happy to do that as well. These are always intended to be set up as dialogues, but this doesn't look like a dialogue setting. If it's dialogue, this is kind of an intimidating one for me. The numbers are all on your side. And I'm here to talk specifically tonight from one foundation's experience, the Henry Luce Foundation's experience, where I worked for a little bit more than 20 years. It'll be 21 years this coming summer. Luce Foundation is not a religious organization. I would want to be clear about that at the outset. It's a grant-making foundation. I'm not a religious leader myself. I'm not a religion scholar. But I'm going to be talking about understandings of religion and the practice of foreign policy and in international affairs more broadly. I'm particularly focused on the U.S. out kind of perspective, but the work we've been doing has also been based in other countries where there are sometimes U.S. players, but not U.S. Leaders of the projects. Let me say just a couple words about the Luce Foundation at the start, and then move more swiftly into what we're talking about. We described our foundation was created in 1936, as Kevin was saying, by Henry Luce, the founder of Time magazine, when he was still actually a fairly young person. Foundation today describes this work essentially as a catalyst for learning and leadership, and increasing the kind of learning experiences for leaders and producing leaders who will learn it for our common life. We have limited resources, obviously, like any other foundation, and so we tend to work in a small number of areas that are kind of idiosyncratic in some ways that reflect the interests of the family whose fortune founded our work. But sort of uniquely among foundations today, we tend to work for the really long-term perspective. And so we look at things that we want to stay with for a long time. And so since 1936, we have been trying to increase Americans' capacity to understand Asia. Henry Luce was born in China when his parents were missionary educators there. And so while the work was very Sino-centric to begin with, ever since the 1930s, we've been just essentially trying to increase American folks' capacity to understand a part of the world. I grew up in Appalachia, so it was a part of the world that was absolutely unknown to me. The founder was born in a missionary compound. The foundation has no missionary goals. Some time back, I had visitors from China who said, we're very interested in what it's like to work at a Christian foundation. And I said, so am I, but this is not one. That might be an interesting experience, but I don't know that I'm prepared for it. We don't have a commitment to a specific religious tradition. And in fact, in our day, we have a commitment to increasing understanding of multiple religious traditions. And that was a little bit how we got into this work. From the outset, though, we believe that knowledge about religion should be part of the intellectual and cultural formation of leaders of all kinds. Not to be religious, but to know about religion, we think, is really essential for leaders. And it's not something, we think, that can be relegated entirely to the private sphere. So I don't care where my religious leaders go to church, and I don't care to what holy ones they speak. But I expect that they would be knowledgeable about the culture of a religious tradition that I come from, and that they would understand it as authentic and legitimate among other traditions. Our focus is particularly at the Luce Foundation, as I said, on learning and leadership, and it's leadership that I want to talk about particularly tonight. How it's shaped and whether or not religion might factor in. Religion as a study and religion as a cultural force in the world. I've given a talk that's like this before, several times, as you can imagine. I've been on the road with the Luce Foundation for a long time. And so sometimes I talk about sort of leaders in the public policy sphere. Sometimes I'm talking about academics. Sometimes I'm talking about the emergence of leadership on college campuses today. And sometimes I'm talking about the preparation of people for formal roles of religious leadership. I'm going to pretty much dwell on that first thing in the short period of time we have tonight. But if you're interested in any of these threads related to those other communities, let me pick it up. Let me give you a flashback at the start. I mean, in 2004, this happens in foundations. In 2004, we had decided at the Luce Foundation to end one of our historic programs. And this was going to recapture some resources that we could repurpose for something else. And we were keeping our work in religion, we were keeping our work in women in STEM and in American art and in Asian studies, but we wanted to break some new ground. And we were puzzling for a long time. And finally, one of our board members, who had been the president of a major university, but had also been the US ambassador to Korea during the 1990s, said, this is his quote, "I can't think of a more important gap today in our foreign affairs than the US government's lack of knowledge about world religions and their importance." Okay, I'll say it again, because it was, I can't think of a more important gap today in our foreign affairs than the US government's lack of knowledge of world religions and their importance. Now, this is 2004, so remember, so this is a post 9/11 conversation. Excuse me, when he told us this was kind of a wake-up call to us. I mean, this was a thoughtful guy on our board who had been one of the architects of our planning. And so we started thinking, how would we approach this? And I went off to talk to a number of people, and one of them was a recent Secretary of Defense, or Deputy Secretary of Defense, who had been the secretary during all 8 of the Clinton years in the White House. And he said, he was talking to me about the war in Iraq, which was right then, or the US intervention in Iraq, I think is we should describe it, but which was then a pretty new event. And he said, I said, is this topic that we're thinking about exploring worth it? And can we get any takers if we start offering grants in this field? You know, is anybody really interested in it? You know, we're going to be able to break any new ground. And he said, let me give you an example. He said, our country's mission in Iraq was critically undermined when our senior representatives to we remember the coalition's provisional authority, were not briefed on the differences between Shia and Sunni Muslims. Okay. That we send people to lead the provisional government, and there was no briefing about religion at all. They weren't told who the leaders were of particular communities. They weren't explained historic differences among the sects. They didn't know who lived where and who was important. They didn't understand also which conflicts were historic and which ones were most subject to solutions. They didn't understand those traditions relative to modern nation states. They were clueless, essentially, as I was, probably in the same years, thinking about that part of the world, but I wasn't in charge of the provisional authority. Within a short time of his arrival, Paul Bremer is rumored to have written to the Ayatollah al-Sistani, saying that he was in Baghdad now, representing the US government and the United Nations forces, and that anytime the Sistani wanted to come to see him in Baghdad, he'd be happy to see him. The Ayatollah al-Sistani, you know, is a major, major leader. It was a little bit like me sending a message to the Pope saying, I'm going to be in Athens for a couple of months. Why don't you come over and see me, Pope? You know, it's just like ludicrous, you know, and it was such a colossal misunderstanding. But within 3 months of his arrival in Baghdad, Paul Bremer wrote to Donald Rumsfeld, the imams won't cooperate. We're going to have to take Iraq without them. This was astonishing, as he described it at lunch. He said, this is really the issue that you have to deal with. The question is, why weren't they briefed? We know a lot. There's a lot of information about religion available in this country in the academic communities. But in general, it was because religion wasn't considered one of the important factors, like geography or the economy or language or history, that we would expect to brief our diplomats or our military officers. It was just considered to be essentially off the table. And many people in the government believed that the US understanding of the separation of church and state really militated against that kind of briefing. You know, how could you possibly brief people that you were sending to lead kind of government organizations or major military installations? How could you send them with knowledge of religion when we believe in this country in a separation of church and state? A dozen years later, I would say this has quite changed. You know, I think that today we would all admit that this has greatly changed. In 2005, the Luce Foundation's board voted to set aside some resources every year to invest in kind of increasing the capacity of people in the U.S. government to know about religions in other parts of the world. We called it the HRLI, the Henry R. Luce Initiative in Religion and International Affairs. If you Google Henry Luce Foundation, you can go to our website and you can see kind of the array of grants. We've been able in a dozen years to invest about $40 million in that work, primarily in the creation of intellectual resources, but also in trying to get them out, try to get them in different people's hands. That's 15 years since that first conversation, and I realized that both people were right, that this was a singular gap in our foreign policy, no matter which party was in the White House or who was the Secretary of State, that this was a kind of singular gap that was within the Luce Foundation's wheelhouse somehow to address. And sadly, John Henry, the Defense Deputy Secretary, was also right, that we are still embroiled in conflicts in Iraq because of that fundamental failure in our briefing of him. Today, things are better. We, at the outset, authorized a kind of a survey project that was done by the Center for Strategic and International Studies that resulted in a terrific report, still very readable today, that's called Mixed Blessings, that was about where you could get knowledge about particular religious traditions if you worked in the State Department. And where in the training of foreign service officers would you find this kind of stuff? And where, if you were at the military academies, you know, and in the advanced training of military officers, and where in the big development organizations like USAID, would you be able to at least get access to that information? Much more public discussion today, much more scholarship, much engagement with religious communities at the White House and at the State Department and the Defense Department. That remains true in some ways, I would say, even in the current administration. And so while there's a very different attitude, obviously, about U.S. policy, and an attitude that I don't embrace, there still is some of this work. When John Kerry was secretary, when he was functioning as the Secretary of State, before he was named to be the secretary, he was trying to figure out why he had lost the election in 2004. And in some of the focus groups about his loss of the election, he was told that it was because he was tone deaf about religion. That he had lost the election in Ohio specifically, where I'm from, and that was the last state that made the difference in the election, not that it wasn't decided by 49 other states. But he lost it there because he had not understood how he had to work with the Catholic bishops in Ohio. That he had to craft a position that they could understand and that they could at least take a neutral position on rather than condemning him. That had made the difference. And so when he came to the State Department as secretary, he appointed somebody to develop an Office of Religious Affairs in state. And in the 4 years that he was secretary, it grew to 30 experts. Something that has been essentially dismantled in the past 2 years, but replaced still by some folks, including Sam Brownback, working particularly in questions of international religious freedom. We have a clearer understanding today, I would think, than we did 10, 12, 15 years ago about the way that various religions or religious communities have been involved in conflict, how they've been participants in it, how they've generated it. We also know more about their capacity, not just around violence and oppression, which I think we know a lot about, but we know more also about how to engage those communities in the work of reconciliation. We're not always doing a very good job of it, but it's one of the things that we're trying to do. Let me just say one more sort of general thing, and then give you a couple examples of the work, and then stop. From the outset, we really tried to take a pretty broadly gauged approach. In Kevin's seminar this afternoon, just as we were putting on our coats, they said, "Oh, there's one thing I forgot to say," and that was that the Luce Foundation has tried to see its work as primarily responsive, not so much as directive. And so we rarely invite proposals for a particular thing. We instead say we're open to proposals in this area. Kind of give us your best thinking, and we'll see what it is that we can possibly support. And so at the outset in describing this in 2005, when we first began to do grant making, everybody thought that we wanted to talk about what was framed as either the clash of civilizations, as Sam Huntington's term, or sort of Islam and the West, as if Islam didn't exist as a religion in the West, or that the West was somehow could be juxtaposed with Islam. And we also didn't want to focus exclusively on conflict or on security studies. We thought the understanding of the world's religions really needed to also to be called upon for other forms of cultural exchange and development assistance and environmental issues and educational issues and gender studies. That there was almost no field of international affairs where this would not be helpful, and we were trying to avoid getting caught in that box. But if you look at the survey of our grant making for the last couple of years, we realize that there still is a great deal of suspicion and misinformation about some of the world's religious traditions more than others. That there is still some demonization of certain traditions, whether we're talking about the practice of foreign policy or whether we're talking about life in these United States. And so we have devoted probably an inordinate share of the resources to understandings of Islam. There are a billion, maybe 1.6 billion Muslims in the world people who would consider themselves adherents of Islam, and as large as the Muslim population is in this country, our military leaders and our governmental leaders, our diplomats, have been really pretty ignorant about that. There's also been, in the years that we've been doing this project, an increased religiously sponsored violence, or religiously motivated violence, not always sponsored. And there's been a rise of various forms of phobia about certain religious traditions. And so I thought at the outset, I said, that I had gone off to Washington to ask various people whether there would be any takers if we had an initiative like this. And I said to our board, let's evaluate it in 3 years and decide whether to continue. At 5 years, we said, we're still getting good projects. We're now 14 years in June, and realizing that there is still work for us to be done. Particularly around protecting the role of religious minorities and understanding that religious communities are plural within themselves. There's a spectrum of beliefs and practices within any of the world's religious traditions. Let me close then with just a couple of examples, and I'm happy to call on more, but we'll wait till we're in questions about it. So we've done a fair amount of work about understandings of Islam in different parts of the world in response to the very concern I just was raising. Not exclusively in the Middle East, in sub-Saharan Africa, in this country, and in Southeast Asia particularly. One of the most interesting projects lately has been about Islam and Russia, and in Russian international relations. We've also been, in thinking of Russia, we've been paying a lot of attention to the kind of return of the kind of importance of the Russian Orthodox Church, or the Russian Orthodox churches, and what role that plays in their practice of foreign policy and what we need to be thinking about on our side, separate from the Mueller investigation. We've supported a bunch of studies about the capacity of U.S.-funded, federally funded development efforts, their capacity to work in tandem with religious organizations in the delivery of foreign aid. For a long time, this was thought to be verboten, so that you couldn't work with Catholic Relief Service or Lutheran World Services or any of those kinds of organizations, that you couldn't partner with them without violating the understanding of the relationship of church and state. Nor, more importantly, could you work with the religious actors on the ground in places you were delivering the aid. And so we would not have made progress in our investment, and the world would not have made progress about the, at least, reduction of the mortality rates related to HIV and AIDS in Africa if it had not been for collaboration with religious authorities, religious organizations, and particularly with local religious communities. Because religion isn't, it's not only, religious traditions aren't monolithic, but they're also not particularly top-down, as much as the Pope might believe that, but are actually about the practices of people in everyday communities and who are devoted in that way. We've done a lot of work, of course, related, or we've supported a lot of work. We don't do the work. Other people do this work. We've supported a lot of work about the Burmese-Bangladesh border and about the understanding of Rohingya people. In this country, so as much vilification and demonization there is of Islam in this country, there is a kind of pious understanding of Buddhism that's similarly monolithic and false. And so it was just unimaginable to many people in this country that martial law had to be declared because of Muslim Buddhist violence in the streets of Mandalay. That nobody could even understand that. We've been really interested in gender and reproductive rights in Latin America and the hegemony of the Catholic Church, and saying if we were going to support a foreign policy that is supportive of women's rights, then we really have to tackle the way that we engage our religious authorities and our diplomats do. One of the coolest projects that we've been working on, I've just mentioned two cool ones and then I'll quit. One of the coolest, it's a really little project right now that Notre Dame University is supporting, and it's on what's called the Humanitarian Corridor. And there's a tremendous resistance, obviously we all read about it, in Italy right now to the arrival of so many people coming across the Mediterranean. And people who are so desperate, that they are willing to take these extraordinarily risky journeys, a loss of life and family members, in order to resettle in a place that offers them more opportunity, and then find themselves being, not only vastly discriminated against, but essentially just shut out of Italian society. And so through the community of San Egidio in Rome, Notre Dame is partnering in a project that creates humanitarian corridors. And they're metaphorical corridors, but these are pathways into Italian society that are being structured by the welcome of religious communities. I understand that there's some work being thought of here around asylum seekers in this neighborhood that's very parallel to this one. The other one, I said that from the outset we didn't want to be just working in conflict or in security studies or in one religious tradition. Another one that relates to the environment is happening in that kind of high Himalayan region, and then goes down through the countries of Southeast Asia, and is looking at sacred claims to water. That the rivers that run through these countries are understood as sacred. That those resources are not just important for life and the well-being of communities, but this is where one is often most authentically in touch with the splendor of creation and the kind of contact with the divine. But these waters flow through many countries, from the high Himalaya down to the seas. And as they pass through these various countries, people are building dams. In the high waters and in the low waters for hydroelectric plants and for a variety of things that are enormously offensive under the people who see that water as sacred and belonging to them specifically, but to all of us. And so we're trying to break open these things, saying, what does a sensitive U.S. policy look like? I'm trying to clarify that what will eventually result in conflict certainly boundary disputes, huge economic issues about development. What kind of understanding of these religious claims can we provide for our policymakers so that we can do this work a little bit better? And the same way we can open up various pathways in other countries, and that we can do a better job than we did with the provisional authority. So let me stop there. And that was a little more than you bargained for. And it's a school night. Let me welcome observations, or Isaac, I'm sorry, I took your role.
I want to thank you very much for
You're welcome.
this beautiful speech. I would like you please to make your question read so we can answer and address everyone's question. Any questions?
Testing.
Right here.
Hi.
Are you doing any work in the United States with religious communities like you said you mentioned the environment. I'm thinking in particular of evangelical Christians in the United States that don't believe in global warming. Are you doing anything to study that and how maybe you might shed some light and enlightenment in this area?
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the question.
I may just want to repeat a bit of the question. Not everyone in the back may have heard it.
So let's see if I can capture it. She was asking if the Luce Foundation is doing anything around in this country, particularly with religious communities in this country, and she was citing the example of evangelical Christians who deny climate change. Yeah, right. Is that great? Not in this initiative, because this initiative is looking primarily at international affairs. We are looking at the kind of connections between Islamophobia in this country and Islamophobia and U.S. foreign policy, but we're addressing this in a different way. And so this is a kind of a policy and academic research and a network building initiative. We have a historic theology program. And we've had a program that funds research and leadership development in theology since the 1930s. And so what we have done is to move, some of you all probably are listeners to National Public Radio. You would know, if you are, you know Krista Tippett's program that's called On Being. And we've been since Krista's earliest days with that program, but she was just growing it out of St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota, with Minnesota Public Radio. We've been supporting her work in a project that's called Public Theology Reimagined. And the project is intended to take issues like that one, like the questions of different religious understandings of the environment, and to bring people into conversation about it. And so that then spawned what probably is now about half of the funding of our theology program is around questions you would call public theology, about the role of religion in the public sphere, about religious voices in the public sphere, and then about making a space for religion, teaching about religion in public universities. And so we think that we have tried steadily to say that religious communities have a right to their claims, and that we recognize that there are some that our board and our staff probably align ourselves more with than others, but that we've tried to be supportive across the spectrum. And so we are now working with several different evangelical seminaries where there are progressive thinkers about the environment who are trying to speak to their specific religious constituency. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. Yes.
Do you have any programs where you work with the U.S. military? Because often the military is a real point of contact in all these regions, and in my experience, there's also quite a bit of anti-Islamic feeling that runs pretty hot in that institution.
Yeah, and it's hard to understand exactly. I mean, the anti-Islamic sentiment in the U.S. military, it doesn't make a lot of sense, except that, I think, let's see, I'll say a couple of things. I think that the U.S. military is probably one of our most efficient ways of developing leadership in this country. I think we have a great history. I think that they have perhaps the most conscientious, well thought out effective forms of leadership development, recognizing young people with capacity, moving through sets of experiences where they encounter tough challenges that are real, and helping them to learn by making mistakes. You know, it's a little bit like the Marlboro method in many ways. You know, but a lot of support for leadership development. And so we have been eager to work with the Department of Defense because it seemed to us that these were folks who were most likely on the ground to be dealing with local religious communities. You know, and who needed, and sort of at every rank. But obviously, you need the support and hierarchical organizations of the folks at the top. Primarily, what we've been doing most recently is working with Georgetown University, where there is a center at Georgetown that's called Berkeley that is Jack DeJoy, the president of Georgetown's presidential initiative. So it's lodged squarely in his office. It's not lodged in the Department of Religion or in political science or anyplace else. It's a program on religion and peacemaking. And they have developed modules that can be taught both in the Foreign Service Academy and in the military academies. And so they're developing the materials. They're very classroom specific for those audiences. And then putting together really fabulous briefing materials also to make sure that you know, in the same way that we worked with Congressional Research Service, you know, the CRS. CRS is a division of the Library of Congress. I wasn't aware of this until I worked at the Luce Foundation. Congressional Research Service is a research unit within the Library of Congress, 700 researchers who do research just for members of Congress. Okay, this is their full-time job. The most splendid briefing papers, mostly ignored. And so we've been working with CRS also because they have strong relationships through, you know, congressional affairs into the Defense Department, making sure that this good stuff just gets in the people's hands who can use it. Okay. The other piece of that, and you know, we've used multiple strategies. We've worked with universities trying to provide support for faculty work on these topics. But more important than supporting the faculty work was supporting getting it out. And that, if there's anything Henry Luce like about our work, it's that. You know, that I mean, Henry Luce, Time Magazine was a clipping service. You know, in the 1920s, you know, and so it's how do you take really good stuff and get it in other people's hands? How do you break it out of the ivory tower? And so we've been supporting for, I don't know, 7 or 8 years a series of projects that bring journalists together with religion scholars with policymakers. That triad, putting them together in seminars that exist over a period of time where they can create relationships. We also decided that you don't influence members of Congress through good papers. There's no shortage of good papers going to Congress. You influence them through constituent buzz, you know? And so we started buying up airtime by making grants to PRI the World, and to Marketplace Radio, or the Marketplace program on NPR, as well as programs that have specifically religious character. We now fund religious reporting at The Atlantic, which was religion phobic for a long time, and American Abroad Media. We think if you can continue to raise the focus of this, then policymakers will say, this is something I need to know about. You know, people are hearing it on their ride to work, on the radio, and that anytime that you're trying to influence U.S. policy, you're kind of like working with one office at a time. Stop.
Your institution is
Yes.
great. And I wish you all the luck in the work for what you're doing for the world. My question is, knowing what went on during 30s and 40s, the hardship that so many people felt, and the role of religion and government during those, have we learn and does your institution teaches the new generation to avoid the tragedies that are taking place in Yemen, the tragedies that are taking place against other minorities, religious minorities, including Baha'is in Iran and other places? Have your institution tried to best explain what we learned from the 30s and 40s to avoid the same tragedies in the future?
It's a really important question. Let me use an anecdote to begin, kind of explain the motivation. So I was born in 1949, and my parents were only like 21 when I was born, and we were growing up in coal mine country in Ohio, and there was pretty limited information to world knowledge in coal mine country in Ohio in the 1940s. But my mother was obsessed with the Holocaust. And she was an evangelical Christian. And she was just obsessed that how good people could have so neglected a clear reality. And when she decided to join my father and become a Catholic in the middle 1950s, she was then horrified by what she was beginning to find out about silence coming from religious leaders across Europe. That clearly people knew what was happening in the genocide. You know, that there unquestionably people of faith. And so we know that, you know, in that immediately in the post-World War II era, there was a kind of explosion of interest in ecumenical relations, and a lot of people who were focused themselves on the work of reconciliation, but even more than reconciliation, who were focused on repentance. You know, that they had participated in a grave moral evil simply by their silence, but they were accomplices. You know, and that in this recognition of themselves, it was a little bit in Amir's class today. Amir was talking about this: is how can good people go on living with themselves when they've done something bad? You know, that you can only go on living with yourself if you say, I can be a good person, and I have to admit and own up to and repent for and try to create a renewal based on the bad thing that happened. So this has a very personal resonance for me. It was what I grew up with, you know, that we had Holocaust Remembrance Day in our little Appalachian house, you know, because my mom had gotten onto this, and she was going to teach her kids, you know, that we were not going to be complicit this way, that we had to stand up. And so at Christmas time this year, my mother has been gone for some years. At Christmas time, my brother said, "Do you remember what Mom told us about the Holocaust?" He said, "Our family gifts this year have to be to one another for support for the starving people in Yemen." You know, that he said we have to basically stop funding one another's tchotchkes in our houses and, you know, buying one more ski sweater, you know, for kids who don't wear them anyway. Instead of that, what we need to do is to say we've got to join the force for good on this. And then he said we've got to be smarter than that. We've got to move beyond it. Okay, so that's my family, kind of talking about 70 years kind of a family's life. What we have tried to do is, in our concern about making sure that religions are not understood as monolithic, is to pick up minority traditions within them, and to say, how are these voices lifted up? How are they heard? And how are their experiences authenticated? So even as we were talking about evangelical Christians, well, I don't consider myself in that camp at all. I think how is it that we kind of understand what the claims are and mediate them in various ways. We have a young adult leadership program where we send 18 people with great promise of leadership in American life every year for immersive experiences in Asia. And at the end of the year, we spend 10 days in a country where none of them is visited, meeting rising leaders in the country who will be their peers, essentially, in any field, in science and arts and human rights work, and medicine. And part of that experience every year is that we try to acquaint them with minority traditions and religions practiced in the country where we are. So we spend a whole long time on the history of Jews in China. And you know, the Jewish members of the cohort had no idea there were Jews in China at all, or there ever had been, or what they were doing there, And so we did that, and I didn't know much about it either. When we were in Indonesia a couple summers ago, we spent our time with a group of people who call themselves Waria in Yogyakarta. I think this is a term that's maybe used across Indonesia, who are people who would be trans, in our understanding. And they were people they were creating safe places for kids who were coming out and who were being stoned in their small villages, but coming out as lesbian and gay. And said, who would have thought, that this group of men and women existed, in all of our kind of understandings about the practice of Islam, varied as it is in Indonesia. So we're looking at this as best we can. We're looking at it particularly about migrant communities, about people on the move, whose traditions might not be understood in their complexity or in their particular part, and it's specifically for the people who lose their homes, who are forced out of their homes because of religious claims. Maybe one more, because I think we're probably at the time when it's bedtime. Yeah.
I guess I'm very curious about your work with the Defense Department, et cetera, and to how much just basic cultural studies, which would deal with religion, but also with other practices within, I think, 10 years ago, 8 years ago, when I read Rory Stewart's book on Places in Between.
Yes.
I thought every soldier should get a copy of that book before he leaves for Afghanistan or for Iraq.
Yeah.
Some general understanding of what's important in the cultural world where they're going, instead of just, what one looks like an enemy.
Yes. Yeah.
And particularly, talking to young men that have been sent, that had no clue that their training was in how to calculate how much bombs it took to blow up the inside of a house that's a certain dimension.
Yeah.
But nothing about the people that live in it, or why they have a wall around their house, or, it's just sort of, is things being done, and are things being done?
I think there's hopeful news on this horizon. So I think that and things that we have to repent about, and there are many, and I say we as a people, I mean that we're functioning in Vermont tonight in the United States of America. So I'm saying we, I mean people who live here have to repent about, is that we did a really bad job of this during the 1960s and the 1970s. We withheld information from our troops about the people with whom they were interacting. We withheld the government withheld information from the American people, about what the bombing targets were, and why, and to what extent. And I saw a very painful example of this when we were having our young leaders wrap up in Laos a few years back. And there was a young man who had asked, he was chosen for our program, and he was a rehab specialist. He was a doctoral student in rehab at a major state university. And his project in graduate school was about the design of prostheses that would be available in low-income communities. And so he asked to be sent to Laos because he knew that there were a lot of people who were maimed from the bombing, but being maimed every day by the bomblets, they keep being turned up, from the secret bombing campaign. Okay, the greatest penetration of U.S. firepower in history. Okay, in Laos, and so he led off the presentations that year talking about his work in Laos and how he had actually been able to design a wheelchair that would run on muddy streets in rainy season. That he was an engineer and he had been able to come up with this wheelchair, and this was the kind of accomplishment of his year. And then he said, the reason I did it, he said, is that my dad was a fighter pilot in the war, and that he did not even know where these missions were, but where he was dropping these weapons. And he said, I have responsibility to return there, and I can't, there are all kinds of efforts to kind of dig these bombs out. And so These stories are very powerful, I think.
How about with Native American Indians in sacred places along the border?
It's huge, and so we're able, because of this initiative, we're stretching its boundaries to say that the sovereign nations, the tribal nations, really are independent nations that should be involved in a foreign policy initiative. But we also, through what we've been learning on this, are just a launching initiative. You'll be able to read about this summer, where we're trying to strengthen the audibility and the visibility of public intellectual leaders in Native communities, thinking that Native communities in this country get the smallest share of formal philanthropy. They often have the highest rates of poverty and various kinds of illnesses that are related to poverty, not to character weaknesses, and that the resources of those communities are not understood. And so what we're trying to do is to say there are thriving intellectual resources in these communities. And the Luce Foundation wants to identify them with our name and lift them up in the same way we've lifted up these generations of young Americans and other kinds of folks. You've been very kind to be patient. I've gone on a long time tonight. It's a pleasure to get to meet you. I'll stick around for a few minutes if I can, and thanks for coming out. Thanks for the work you do.
Quickly, I thought you could give a brief report on the next 4 people.
Sure.
Okay, again, we are grateful you came. We have 4 more sessions, and next week, yes, and he will go and explain to you the background.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was really very inspiring and thoughtful conversation. Take with us. Our next session is going to be Wednesday night, a week from tonight. Kurt Talbot, who's an environmental lawyer who's done lots of work on issues of corruption and transparency, is going to be talking about some of those sets of issues here. And he's going to be in class from 4:30 to 5:30. If some community members would like to come up to the dining hall at the college and join us for a meal before coming down here, you'd be very welcome to do that. And again, thank you, Ishak, for hosting us tonight. And Scott, it's always a pleasure to be here at your wonderful space. Thank you, and may I say good night to everybody? Good night.